So Susan Thrasher is tonight's guest speaker. I met her a few years ago when I was working for a TV show, and she is an excellent angler. She's an avid fly angler and guide. She's authored a book called Thrasher's Fly Fishing Guide, an essential handbook for all skill levels. She is a Middle Tennessee retreat leader for Casting for Recovery, which is a nonprofit that focuses on breast cancer survivors and the healing nature of fly fishing. She also co-founded Music City Fly Girls, which is a group of women that get together every month for fishing activities, or maybe they even travel. I hear there was a Wyoming trip, but they are all about fly fishing. And in 2004, Susan started the Southern Brookies Fly Service, and then by 2015, she decided, I'm going to leave the old world behind, and I'm going to become a full-time guide. And so she's not only an excellent guide, she's a great teacher, and that's why I asked her to come tonight and present for us. So Susan, thank you for being here.
Well, thanks so much, Barry. I really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for joining in. I saw some familiar faces and names as folks were coming into the room. So I really appreciate it. I have set up a slideshow for tonight, and I'm just going to step through some of the very basics. When we tried to set this up before a couple of times this evening, it kicked me out of the slides. So it might take us 2 times to do this, but I'm just going to go ahead and get started here and see if I can broadcast with no problems. Hey, very good. All right, it worked. All right. So the way this is going to work, I'm just going to, I'll switch through the different slides, and I'll go through a little agenda and show you what you can expect through the evening. And I'm open throughout the whole time to be interrupted for questions. I know what it's like if you've got a burning question, you don't want to lose it. And so feel free to use the little chat feature and send your questions in to Barry, and he'll be monitoring those, and he can just interrupt me as we go along. So anyway, what I thought, Barry just said, looking at it like, folks haven't ever come to the sport before, but also I know that there's some people that have fished. And so I'm trying to make it not just so basic, even though I will cover the basics, but I've got something in there for even some experienced anglers that I think you'll be surprised you might actually learn a thing or two. So I'm going to start off just by going through how fly fishing differs from conventional fishing, or worm dunking, as I affectionately call it. And then we'll go through some of the equipment, some of the terminology. As some of you know, if you've ever looked at any kind of fly fishing gear, you probably have seen stuff that almost looks Greek, like you have no clue what those terms are. And we're going to try to take the mystery out of some of that. I'm going to go through some of the fly fishing techniques and some of the different flies, some of my own favorite flies I'm going to share with you. Then just if you don't have any gear at all, we're going to take some time to go through the gear that you have to have. You don't need to break the bank just to start up a new sport. And I'm just going to walk through some of the things that you really need to have to actually get out in the water. I'm going to go through some of the knots that you need to know. There's really just 3 very basic knots that are important for you. And it's going to be hard with a virtual class to go through much, casting demonstration, but I am going to cover 2 of the casts that you need to know and just walk through those a little bit. We will go through, I'm going to talk to you about some of the tailwaters and the generation schedule that you need to be. It's critical that you're familiar with that. And then we'll talk about the winter stocking program that TWRA has. And then I'm going to share with you some of the guides in the area, specifically in Middle Tennessee, but I'll hit on some in the East Tennessee area as well. So, so that I'll just jump right in. And if I didn't cover a topic that you are hoping that I would, I'm sure that we'll have time and I can slide it in for you. So first off, we'll start with how fly fishing differs from just your traditional fishing. If you've ever tried just spin casting or bait casting, you know that it's the weight of the lure or the sinker, that's what is cast out, and then the fishing line just comes out behind it. And with fly fishing, it's different in that you're using the weight of the fly line to actually get your fly out and presented to the fish. So when I first started out, I used to think if I put a big honking fly on the end of my line, that I would really be able to get it out there, you know, a long distance. And it's just the opposite, because, you know, a big heavy fly is going to be more wind resistant, and you aren't casting the weight of that fly. You're casting the weight of the fly line, and your fly is just going along as a passenger. So I tell people, just remember, if you have a heavy passenger, it's going to be harder to cast. So kind of just opposite of what you would think. So when you're casting and how this works with the weight of the fly line, your rod, as you pick the line up off the water, the surface tension of the water is going to try to hold that line down on the water. So as you're starting to lift it off the water, you'll see that your rod bends. So you can see in this photo how the rod is bending, and we call that loading the rod. So it just is storing up some potential energy so that when you come to a stop, the rod will unload or come to a straight position, and then your fly line will just be kind of slingshotted right behind you, and it will form a loop. You pause long enough on that back cast so that your line will straighten all the way out. And then as you come forward on your forward cast, your rod is going to load up again, just like it did on the back cast. And when you stop forward, then you have an unrolling forward loop. And this is what will carry your fly and present it out into the water. So it's the unrolling of the loop behind you in a back cast, and then the unrolling of the loop ahead of you in the forward cast. So if you can just remember, if you're just starting out, fly fishing doesn't require a lot of power or a lot of strength. In fact, a lot of times I've taught many women and men to fish, and a lot of times females can be a little bit easier to teach, just because guys are so powerful and are thinking more about muscling the fly out and presenting it into the water, as opposed to when I say it's all about finesse. Sometimes that seems to click a little bit quicker with women, you know, just to be a little bit softer with the touch. But if you can just keep that in mind when you're learning that it's not about power, it's not about muscle, that the softer that you can perform that back cast and the forward cast, the easier it's going to be to present that fly. So that's one of the biggest differences in traditional fishing and fly fishing. Another difference is that you use all artificial flies. There have been times I've had people say, would you just go out and catch a fly, like a house fly, and put it on the hook? And I mean, that would seem, you know, logical, but everything that you use in fly fishing is, it's all artificial. You are trying to match what's actually out there in nature. And I'll show you some of those flies as we move along. So just getting into fly fishing, you're going to need some equipment. And I thought what would be really helpful is just to start with the very basics. And if you were to walk into a fly shop and start to, you know, pull together your fly line, your reel, your rod, what is it that you would look for? And I'm just going to step through starting at the very first, and that's with the backing. So if you buy your reel there at the fly shop, the first thing that the fly shop's going to put on for you is something called backing. And really, if you look at backing, it's almost like kite string. It's a Dacron kind of a material, real thin, kind of a string looking material. And it serves two purposes. Number one, if you were to put your fly line directly on the reel without having backing, it would be wound around very tightly around the spool. So when the fly line comes off, it would be more like in coils instead of in a straight line. Having the backing added to your reel first adds a little bit of bulk to the spool. And so it gives it a little wider diameter. So then when your fly line is wrapped around the backing, it's not going to coil quite as badly. The other thing is backing can be thought of as insurance. So your typical fly line is 90 feet long. And fly line, as I mentioned before, is all about finesse. You aren't going to muscle in a fish on a fly rod. It's, you know, the trout especially have very tender mouths, and it's more like a dance. You let them run, then you bring them in. You let them run, you tire them out. But if you try to put a lot of pressure on with a very fine leader, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and a small fly, it's just going to rip right out of their mouths. Well, if you catch a large fish and you aren't able to put on that pressure, your fly line, all 90 feet of that fly line could go out and the fish still be running and has not run out of energy. If that's all that you had on your reel was the fly line and you didn't have the backing, you'd be in a lot of trouble. You'd probably just lose the fish. But the backing actually serves as a little insurance. So you have an extra amount of length over and above the 90 feet of fly line. And I can tell you, you got to learn some of these terms. One of the greatest things to be able to tell people is the fish was so big, it got into the backing. And it only has happened to me a very few number of times. And mostly you see that more in saltwater fishing. But when it happens with a freshwater trout, that's really something. So anyway, that is backing. The fly, if you let your person in the fly shop put that on for you, they're going to be able to wind it on very tightly and with the machine, and it will go on very, very easy. You could do it yourself, but it will take a lot less time. In fact, if I get a new reel, I usually just take it right to the shop and just let them do it for me, so I don't have to worry about it. So anyway, that's backing. That's the first thing. Okay, attached to the backing is going to be your fly line. And there are a number of different designs of fly lines. There is a level line, which basically means there's no taper to it. It's just, you know, one constant section of a fly line. It doesn't cast very well, so it's more for specialty situations. So I would stay away from a level line. There's also double taper lines. But what I would like to focus on tonight is a very common fly line, and one that I would recommend for any beginner just getting started, and that's called the weight forward floating line. If you are looking at boxes in a fly shop at the different brands and all, you'll see that there's some wording and some letters and numbers that are going to be on the fly boxes. And what you'll look for, what I have up on the screen, is a weight forward. You'll see the WF, weight forward. If it was a double taper, it'd say DT. If it was a level line, it would say L. So you're looking for a WF, or a weight forward. And then the number that's on there is going to be the weight of the line, which I'm going to get into in just a minute. And then you want to look for a floating line. There are sinking lines, but I would say just starting out, you definitely want to start with a floating line. And again, sinking lines are for more specialty situations, and it's a little bit more advanced. So we'll start, again, my recommendation would be a weight forward design and a floating line. So let's just take a look at the profile of what a floating line or weight forward floating line would look like. The overall length of a fly line is around 90 feet. And if you just look at it, you probably wouldn't, if you were to pull it out of the reel and looked at the fly line, you might not notice that there are tapers that are set up in this fly line. But at the very front, you're typically going to have a loop in the front end of your fly line. That's where you attach your leader. And then you'll have a taper, what we call a front taper. and then that will taper to a belly. That's the heaviest section of the fly line. And then you have a rear taper. And then the remaining part of the line is the running line. So the first 40 feet or so of a fly line, that's called the head of the line. And that is the weighted section. That's the part of the fly line that you're going to be casting. That, if you remember me saying, you know, you're casting the weight of the fly line, that's the heavy section of the line that you'll be casting. The running line that extends on the remaining 90 feet is a very thin line that's going to help you with distance casting. It's very thin, so it will run through the guides very easily with very little friction. And so that's why the weight forward line is just so versatile. You can roll cast it easily. You can distance cast it easily. And I know some of those terms might not make sense, but they will here in just a few minutes. So anyway, that's the profile of what a weight forward line will look like. If you already have a fly line, it'd be interesting for you to, now that you know this, because most people when they're first starting out have no clue that there's any change in diameter of their fly line when they first get started. So, you know, take some of that fly line off your reel and take a look at it next time you're out and see if you can identify those tapers. And now you know what they're for. Okay, so let's move on here to fly line weights. As I mentioned, fly lines come in different weights. If you were fishing up in the Smoky Mountains where you don't want your fly line to spook all of the trout, you might use a very lightweight fly line, which is going to have a thinner diameter. And when it lands on the water, it's not going to spook every single fish in the mountains. And then as you move on up and into a tailwater, you might need a little heavier fly line. That would be a 5 or a 6. And then all the way up, if you're going tarpon fishing, you know, you might be looking at a 10 or 11, maybe even a 12, all the way up to marlin fishing, which would be up in the 14 and the 15 weight of fly lines. And on this chart, this gets into a little bit of detail, but I think it's important for you to understand that fly lines are measured and given a weight designation, whether it's a 1 weight, 2 weight, 3 weight. They, the manufacturers weigh the first 30 feet. Remember, a fly line's 90 feet long, but the manufacturers will weigh the first 30 feet of that fly line. And depending on what the weight of it is, that's how they'll designate it with a line weight of a 5 or a 6. That 30 feet is measured in a weighting system called grains. And so whether you buy a fly rod or fly line from Bass Pro Shop, or Walmart brand, a Cabela's brand, an Orvis brand of fly line, if you have, taking a look at the chart, let's say if you have a 5 weight fly line, it should weigh somewhere in the range of 134 to 146 grains. That's the first 30 feet. And the reason, and just like a 6 weight would weigh somewhere in the 152 to 168 grains. The reason why that's important is that you don't have a single fly rod that's like one size fits all. And I'm going to switch over here and show you a fly rod. The fly rod is going to have a marking, several different numbers on it. This particular one you can see is a 9 foot, or it has the number 9 with the foot symbol. That means it's a 9 foot length fly rod. And then the next number is 6. And that means that it's a 6 weight fly rod. So rods are designed to carry the weight of the fly line that you're going to put on them. So in this case, the best action that you're going to get out of this particular fly rod is if you put a 6 weight fly line on it. If you were to put a fly line that was a 10 weight fly line, you could bend your rod so deeply as you're casting it. And remember, the load was that bend in the rod. If you had, 40 feet of that heavy tapered head outside of your rod tip and you're casting a 10 weight fly line, it would just be way too much for this fly rod and it could break it. If you were to take a little 2-weight fly line and try to cast that on a 6-weight fly rod, the rod wouldn't even load. So you wouldn't get that nice bending of the rod. So it'd be very difficult to make those loops. So if you have a fly rod that you've tried casting and you're like, this thing doesn't work for anything. Well, it could be that you have the wrong fly line matched up to it. You want to have a balanced outfit. So if you have a 5-weight fly line or a 5-weight fly rod, you need to match it up with that line designation. Okay. Hopefully that helps. I guess let me take a little break right there. Barry, any questions coming in?
I don't have any questions right now, although I do have a question. When you were talking about backing, I bought a large arbor reel. Now, do you put backing on a large arbor reel too, or do you just put the fly on it?
Yes, because remember, you've got your insurance. Because remember I said it's for 2 different purposes. And even though it's got a large arbor, you'll probably still see it may have that chance to coil. But one of the big things is to make sure that you have that insurance so that if all that line goes out, you at least have, that backup line, that's going to save you from losing a fish.
Okay. I didn't know. I just thought, I know just enough to be dangerous. So I'll ask some crazy questions.
No, that's good. But yeah, you'll still want to have your backing on there for sure.
Okay.
All right, I'll move on here. And any other questions, feel free just to type them right in and we can always go back, even if I've missed something. Okay, so looking at your reel, again, it's not a one size fits all. As you go up in size of your fly line, let's say you have a 2-weight fly line and you compare that diameter with a 10-weight fly line, you're going to see a significant difference in the diameter. So, it just, you have to remember that if you have a smaller size reel, you may not be able to stuff all of that 10-weight fly line into a little 2-weight reel. Now, what's nice is they typically will show, the manufacturers show on the box, and sometimes on the reel itself, that this particular reel is suited for like a 2 or a 3-weight fly line, or it may show that you can put a 6, 7, or a 5, 6, or 7-weight fly line on there. You can also buy, extra spools to put on the reel. But I would say just starting out, just to focus on the one reel and just to make sure that it's going to accommodate the size fly line that you're going to be using. I had a friend that called me not too long ago and she said, I've got this brand new reel, but when I'm reeling up the fly line, it gets stuck. I can't get the whole thing wound in there. And it was because she had bought a 3-weight reel, a reel that would accommodate a 3-weight line, and she was trying to put on a 6-weight fly line. So she had to go up in sizes of her reels just to make that work. The other thing, when you're in the fly shop and you're first getting set up, they're going to ask you, do you want your reel set up as a left or a right hand retrieve? And that can be a little confusing because if you're right-handed, your first thought would be, well, I guess I want it right-handed since I'm right, a right hand retrieve. But that wouldn't be correct because you're going to be casting with your right hand. And when you do use the reel to reel in, you don't want to have to switch hands. You want to be able to use your left hand just to be able to reel in the line. That keeps you from having to switch hands and take the time to do all that. You just keep it on that left-hand side. So if you're a right-hander, you ask for a left-hand retrieve. If you're a left-hander, then you ask for a right-hand retrieve. So hopefully that helps and is clear to you. And then just quickly, we'll go through some of the different sizes of your fly line and your fly rod. You know, if you're first starting out and you know that you typically are going to be fishing maybe up in the Smoky Mountains or on some very small creeks, and maybe you've got a creek in your backyard and you know you're going to spend most of your time fishing for little bluegill or in a little pond, then at that point, you would probably want a smaller weight fly line and fly rod. You'll get a lot of action. There's nothing like catching a little bluegill on a 2 or a 3 weight fly rod. You feel every little bend and movement of that fish, and it's just a whole lot of fun. Same thing if you're fishing up in the Smokies or any kind of a clear mountain stream. You definitely don't want to have a big old heavy 7 weight fly line or 6 weight, even slapping the water with that heavy, thicker diameter. You want to look for a thinner diameter so you'll have a little bit of stealth as you're fishing for some of those trout that are going to spook very easily. So this little chart, and this is going to be recorded, so you'll be able to go back and look at it again. But from if you're fishing for smaller trout and bluegill, a 1 weight to a 4 weight is going to serve you just perfectly. Smaller trout or trout and smaller bass and bluegill. Typically any kind of a tailwater fishing, like around the Caney Fork, South Holston, if you're in East Tennessee, the Watauga, any of those areas, your best all around fly rod, if you're a beginner just starting out, is either a 5 or a 6 weight. A 5 probably, if someone were to say, what would you say is the typical beginning rod to start with? I would say it's a 5 weight fly line and fly rod. So a 5 or a 6 will get it done. Let's say if you think you can only get 1 rod to begin with. Let's say if you can only afford 1 rod right now and you're wanting to switch between fishing for some tailwater trout and also maybe some smallmouth late in the summer, then maybe a 6 weight fly rod would be the one for you, because you could switch off back and forth very easily, between species of fish. Then as you step on up to bigger trout, bass, steelhead, maybe even some smaller salmon, or if you're going redfish fishing, a 7 or an 8 weight fly line and fly rod, then you can just see, you just go all the way on up to, if you're musky fishing, 10 weights. If you get into tarpon, bigger salmon, and then the marlin and the sailfish, that's when you're getting into what we call broomsticks, because they're just such big, heavy fly rods, not heavy in weight, but just such strong rods that can really accommodate those heavier fly lines. But for the fishing that we do around Middle Tennessee, unless you're into the musky, I think starting out with a 5 weight, which can even work for you up in the Smoky Mountains or even on some smaller trout streams, a 5 weight is going to be your best all around line and rod. Okay, before I go any further, anybody have questions about the backing, the reel, or the fly line or the rod? Anything out there?
Right now, I'm not seeing any questions. I asked everyone if everyone could describe themselves. We have a lot of beginners in here tonight and several that say they are novice fishermen, and I would put myself in that category. One thing I was thinking about with the fly line, what you're saying is a rod can accommodate a heavier weight. You don't need to put a heavier weight line on a smaller rod. Is that correct?
Well, you want to balance your outfit. So you wouldn't take a 2 weight fly rod and put a 4 weight fly line on it. You typically are going to want to have, if you have a 5 weight rod, you need a 5 weight line. So we shoot for having a balanced outfit. Does that make sense? Was that what you were asking?
Yeah. So basically, if you do it right, your rod's going to perform better. That's what I'm.
That's right. Yes. And if you do it super right and you really get into it, you're going to end up with a few fly rods. you don't have to, but my sister asked me one time, how many fly rods do you really need? And my answer was, well, one more than I already have. Yeah. But that's because I like fly rods. So, you know, if you're really going to get into fishing on the Smokies, and you know you're going to be in some areas where you're going to have a lot of overhanging brush and rhododendron, and you may not want to go out there with a big, long 9-foot rod. You may want to have a 6.5-foot little 3-weight that's just going to sweetly present that fly, and you aren't going to have to worry about, you know, a big old long rod. But then somebody's going to say, we got to get into muskie fishing. Well, you aren't going to be able to take that little 3-weight and fish for muskie. So, you know, as you start to, just like with anything, hunting or bowling or anything, the more you get into something, the more you're going to want to dial in your gear to exactly the places that you're going to be fishing. Now, okay.
You're talking about a lot of rods. I'm going to ask you one more question. How much does it take? How much am I going to have to spend to get into fly fishing? Because a lot of people are scared off by that, because I was at first. I thought I'd have to spend $1,000 just to get a fly rod, and I found that that's not the case. Is it affordable?
No. Oh, it's absolutely. There's no question at all that it's affordable. First off, you can find just about anything. You know, if you go on eBay, you can get something used. But even if you want to get a brand new setup, which it's a package that would include, you know, the reel, the backing, the fly line, a rod, everything. I mean, you can get a nice setup for between $150 and $200, and that would include even having a warranty and a case that would come along with it. There's, you know, Orvis has a really good package. There's Redington, Temple Fork. I mean, there's a number of different, Cortland. There's another number of different companies that are out there. And these aren't, you know, when you buy a setup like that, you aren't just getting, you know, some, you know, cheap big box store brand that's going to break. I mean, these definitely that, you know, you may have more plastic components like in the reel seat and everything, but definitely a rod that would last you, I mean, that you could use throughout your fishing career if that's all you wanted to start with. So it's definitely affordable. And, but, you know, as you get into it, then, you know, the cost is mainly the components that the rod is made out of. Once you start stepping up into some higher quality components and even materials, you know, a bamboo rod, you can really start spending a lot of money when you get into bamboo. Most of the rods are graphite, or, you know, there's fiberglass has made a big comeback, but you definitely can get into something affordable. Very seldom are you going to find with the newer rods today a bad fly rod. Now, you may find a fly rod that doesn't fit your casting style, but that's why it's important when you go into a fly shop to ask them to take you back in the parking lot and cast a rod. Any fly shop will allow you to do that before you buy a rod. In fact, they encourage it. So anyway, I hope that helps. You aren't going to break the bank, and I think most everyone will be able to get into it for, you know, a couple $100 easily.
Okay.
All right, so we've covered the backing, we've covered the reel, we've covered the rod and the fly line. Now let's take a look at what happens at the end of the fly line, because this is a big important part of how fly fishing differs. We're going to talk about the leader and the tippet, and then the where you attach the fly. All right, so at the end of your fly line, we're going to attach a clear leader, which is, you know, if you aren't familiar with the term leader, it really is looks like what you're normally used to in a fishing line. Leaders are, they're knotless. These manufactured knotless leaders, they typically come in a little package that looks like an envelope, like what I have shown on the screen here. A lot of times you'll get 2 to a package. Sometimes you'll get 3 to a package. And there's going to be some numbers that are on there. We're going to go through those in detail. But before we do that, let's break down the leader a little bit and just show you what the knotless leaders are going to look like. They're going to start out at the left side of your screen. It's going to start out in a thick section. Now, keep in mind this entire section that I'm talking about is called a leader. This overall thing is called a leader, but it's made up of two sections. You have the tapered butt section. That's where it starts out thick, and then it tapers down over, depending on the length of your leader. In this particular case, I've shown a 9-foot long leader, and I'm going to taper over a 7-foot length from thick all the way down. It gets thinner and thinner and thinner. And then at the end of my leader, the final 2 feet, there's not going to be any taper to it at all. It's just going to be one level or one constant diameter for that remaining 2-foot section. That section with no taper in it is called tippet. So again, your overall section, when you pull it out of the little envelope, the package, if it's 9 feet, the overall section, that's called a knotless leader. And there's 2 sections to the leader. There's the tapered butt section. That's the section that goes from thick to thin. And then at the very end, the last 2 feet or so, that's called tippet. And again, it no longer has any taper to it. So that can be a little bit confusing. So I wanted to run through that again. Let's talk with the leaders. When you look at the packages, you're going to see some numbers, and it's important that we go through these so you'll understand it. You can see on the left-hand side there, that's a leader that's been pulled out of the package. It has a loop. It's hard to see that loop, but there's a loop in the end. There's the thick section, and then it's tapering on down to thin. Now, if you look at the photo on the right side, you can see this is a 9-foot long leader. The overall length is 9 feet. There's a designation on here that's called a 3X, which is going to tell you what the size of this leader is at the very tip end, or the tippet. And I'm going to go through that here in just a minute with you so you'll fully understand it. But that last little 2 feet section, remember I called that the tippet. On this package, it shows that it's a 5.6 pound test. That just means the breaking strength of that last 2 feet is 5.6 pounds. So that's that last 2-foot section. It starts with the thick section. The butt section is 20 thousandths of an inch, and then it tapers all the way down to the tippet. And at the tip, you'll see it says 8 thousandths of an inch. Well, so you don't have to continue to think about decimal places when you're fishing. Who wants to do math when they're fishing? We use something that's called the X system, and we refer to that final section of our tippet either as a 0X, 1X, 3X, all the way down to like an 8X is the smallest that I've seen, or the thinnest that I've seen. And I'm going to show you a really good memory aid and tell you a little story about this measuring system. And I think it will help you as you're trying to remember, okay, is a 7X or a 3X thinner? I'm going to jump right into that. In the old days, they didn't have manufactured tapered leaders. They tapered their leaders using the silk from silkworms. And so on the left-hand side, this is a harvested silkworm, and there's 2 glands from the silkworm that have been taken out. These 2 glands are kind of a jelly substance. And if you can see on the left-hand photo, the little strand that's starting to come out of the left little gland, it's kind of like the yarn on the hem of a sweater. If you pull on it, it's just going to continue to unravel. And that's what happens with this little gland. As you pull on that gland, it's going to just stretch out into one long silk strand. And that's what you would see at the top right. So in the photo at the top right, those are the 2 silk glands that have just been pulled, and it just makes like a 10 or a 12 inch long strand of silk. Well, in the old days, after they would harvest these silkworms, they may have let's say 6 or 7 strands of silk to make a 7 or 8 foot long leader. Well, to get the taper into the leader, since they're all the same, about the same diameter, they would take what they called an extruder, which was just like a little razor. It just had a hole in it, and they stuck the silk strand through that little hole of the razor or the shaver, and they pulled it through, and that would just shave it down or make it a little bit thinner. And so the X system came about so that they would know if you pulled it through one time, that's 1X. If you took a smaller extruder, ran it through the second time, that's 2X. If you did it 4 times through, that's 4X. So now they have these tapered leaders that they could tie together, but to get the thinner diameter, they would just shave them down through that extruder. Well, we have kept the X system around, and so now we don't have to think of 8 thousandths of an inch or 7 thousandths of an inch. When we're looking at our tippet sizes, we go by the X system. And you're probably wondering, well, why do I need different sizes of tippet? 1X, 2X, 4X, and that would be a very good question. And so I'll tell you about that. You can see as you have your fly line, and again, you put your knotless tapered leader on your fly line using a loop-to-loop connection, which we'll talk about that in the knot section. And then as your tippet, as you start to nip off the end of your tippet and you tie on your different flies, that tippet is going to get shorter and shorter and shorter, and eventually that 2 foot of tippet is going to be all nipped away. And so to repair your leader, we carry around spools of tippet material. So if you've bought a 3X leader and you've used up all that 2 foot of 3X tippet, you can have a spool of 3X tippet and you just tie on a couple feet to the end of your leader. And then you have, your tapered leader again, all the way down like you first started out. The only difference is you'll have a little knot in it where you've had to repair and tie that on. But let's get into the sizes of the tippet. So your fly sizes, as you go up in number, you're going to go down in hook size. So a size 8 fly going to be a whole lot bigger than a size 16 or an 18 or a 20. They're just going to get very, very tiny as you go up in number. The smallest I've ever fished with was a size 24, and it is teeny tiny. And so the eyes of the hooks are going to get smaller as you go down in size or up in number. The eye of a size 8 is going to be a whole lot larger than the eye of a size 16. And if you don't wear bifocals, you're probably going to buy yourself some readers or have a little flip down magnifier. It's going to make threading the tippet through some of these really small flies a whole lot easier as you get into it. So even don't be proud. Just go ahead and get your readers, because eventually you're going to be using them and you'll make a big difference. All right, so now let's get to how you know the size tippet to use for the size fly. There's a neat little rule that you can use called the rule of 4. If you take the number 4 and divide it into the fly size that you're using, it will give you the approximate tippet size. So if you're first starting out and somebody's told you, you make sure you get some size 12 flies, and then you're thinking, okay, I've got all these size 12 flies, what size tippet should I use? Well, just as a real quick math problem, you could do size 12 fly divided by 4, and I know that I'm going to be using somewhere around a 3X size tippet. So if I have a size 16, as I showed in the formula on the left-hand side, size 16 fly divided by 4, I know that comes out to 4X, so or the number 4, so I'm somewhere in the 4X range. If I'm using a size 20 fly, a very, very small fly, divide that by 4, I know I need somewhere in the 5X range of tippet. Now, it doesn't have to come out exactly with the, you're going to have some rounding. 10 divided by 4 doesn't come out exactly at the number that you need it to. So you don't have to worry about the decimal places. That's why I've put this chart up here. You can see on the far right-hand side, there's my fly size. So from a size 2 to a size 4, I need about a 0x size in my tippet. If I'm using a size 4 to a size 8 fly, I'm going to be somewhere in the 1. Well, let's take a size 8 fly. You can take a look that in this chart, I can either use a size 1x or a size 2x tippet. If I'm using a size 16 fly, I need at least a size 4x, something as small as a size 4x, or I could use a 5x or a 6x, somewhere in that range. It's important to remember if I'm using a size 2 fly, that's a bigger fly, if I try to use like a 5x tippet with a 2x fly, even though it's going to be very easy to stick that 5x through the hook eye of a larger size 2 fly, it'll be very easy to thread it through. It's not going to be strong enough. The 5x just isn't going to be strong enough to deliver that size 2x fly. You need something that's a little beefier in your tippet to actually be able to turn over that loop and to present the fly. So if I tried to use a size 3x in a teeny tiny size 22 fly, there would be absolutely no way I could get that through the eye of the hook. It would just be too small. So the reason I'm telling you this about the ranges is that you don't have to carry along with you when you're fishing from 0x all the way down to an 8x tippet. You can skip in steps of 2. And for myself, I typically have a package of 3x leaders, 9-foot 3x leaders, and then I will carry a spool of 3x, 5x, and sometimes I'll use a 6x. Very seldom will I ever go to a 7 or 8. Or you could buy maybe a 2x leader and you may just have 2x and 4x. And that's all that you would ever use. But for me, myself personally, I typically buy 3x leaders. And because I know that I'm probably not in any given day, maybe not go down below a size 10 fly. And so I don't need a 2x, a 1x, or a 0x, but I have a 3x leader. And then because I know I may use smaller flies, I need to have at least a 3x tippet spool so I can repair my 3x leader. And then I'll use a 5x and a 6x just to accommodate some of those smaller fly sizes.
Quick question for
so
you.
Hopefully, yes.
If I'm new to this and I pull a fly out of my box that I bought at a shop somewhere that didn't really identify what size fly I've got, is there a trick to figure out what I'm using? Is this
there are some little tools. I mean, there's some little tools that you can buy that are like hook gauges that will just have, the various hook sizes shown right on this little, it's almost like a little patch. And you could just, put it up there and measure it, and see which one it fits. Typically though, and it's all based on the gap size, you can see in this picture, that's how the hook sizes are actually determined, is in that gap. Typically though, when you're buying your flies in the bin, they'll always be numbered, unless somebody has put them in the wrong bin. They're always going to have a size 8, 10, 12. They're going to have the little boxes that are going to show. And just starting out, you could create a little box where you keep all your size 14s in one area, all your size 16s in another. And you'll get to the point that you can pick up a fly. I can do that now. I can pick up a fly and look at it and say, that's a size 12 or that's size 14. You're going to get so much more familiar with it. But I know just starting out, I did this when I first started. I just labeled on my fly box itself a row of, these are all size 14s. I did a row, these are all size 18s. Just used the little Sharpie and I wrote on there so I would just know. That's going to be your best way to do it, is just making a note to yourself.
But it's the gap of the hook that really delineates what
it tells you the size. Yes, because the length of your fly is going to be more of a 1X or a 2X or a 3X long nomenclature, and the gap is what's really showing you that size.
Okay.
Okay. All right, let's talk about some fly fishing techniques. When people think about fly fishing, one of the most common and the prettiest ways to fly fish is with a dry fly. And that would be a picture of a dry fly is on the top left square. And the dry flies are made out of very buoyant materials that when you cast the fly and it lands on the surface of the water, the materials are so buoyant, it's just going to float up on the surface. It's not going to sink, it's going to float. And it's very exciting when you see the fish come up and, you know, explode on a dry fly in a take. I mean, everybody would love to just be able to dry fly fish all the time. But 90% of the time, fish are actually feeding subsurface. And so unless you're in an area where you have flies all around and you can see the hatch, we call it a hatch, you can see the flies just thick in the air and the fish are just going crazy. Most of the times, your best bet for catching fish is going to be subsurface. And so dry fly fishing is, and I'll show you a little bit of the setup here in a minute. Dry fly fishing is you're going to cast out your fly and it's just going to float on the surface, and you don't impart any motion to it, you know, with the reel or by using your hand, you know, and pulling in the line. It's basically floating very naturally right along the surface of the water and going at the same speed as the current. That's dry fly fishing. Subsurface fishing with nymphs and with larvae, probably around all of our tailwaters around Middle Tennessee and even into East Tennessee on the Watauga and on the South Holston. I mean, certainly you have opportunities through different seasons of the year, like the sulfur hatch, really great mayfly hatch that happens. And that definitely occurs, but your best opportunities are going to be fishing subsurface on these little nymphs and larvas, and they're going to have some weight to them to get the flies down into the water column, and that's going to be your best bet in fishing. And I'll show you the setup and how you fish subsurface flies here in just a minute. When you're out on the Caney Fork River here in Middle Tennessee, or even on the Elk River, we don't have a whole lot of dry fly action. There are certain periods of the year where we may see some caddis flies, or we may see an occasional midge hatch. There are different types of flies, main flies. We just don't have the time to go into all those flies, but it's a science in itself and very exciting to study about. But if you're fishing on the Caney Fork, you're typically to have any success, typically you're going to be fishing subsurface nymphs and larvas, or this next category, a streamer. Streamer fishing is using a fly that's going to resemble like a leech or a minnow, a crawfish, something like that, more of a bait type fish. Or salamander or something like that. And you can see a picture of a streamer here on the top right. Unlike fishing a dry fly or with the nymphs, where you're just going to let those float and drift naturally through the current, with a streamer, you actually do impart some motion to your fly, meaning you'll take your fly line, stick it underneath your casting hand finger, and you will pull down on the fly line, and that's going to make your fly just dart and swim through the water. Now we call it dead drifting, where you cast out the streamer, you let the fly line belly and the current will just swing that streamer through the current. And it depends, you know, you can try both ways. Sometimes that fast stripping in or fast retrieving of your streamer will really get the fish's attention, and they'll just attack it. But that's called streamer fishing. You may hear people say, you know, they're going to sling some meat. That's using a big streamer that they're just going to pound the banks with these streamers. You cast up against the bank, and then you just retrieve in either slow or quick, or you just try to maybe do a couple of fast strips and then a couple of slow strips. But streamer fishing can be a lot of fun and very effective. And it's really interesting when the fish will just come out from the banks and slam it. There's hardly any better feeling than when that happens. So we've covered dry fly fishing, subsurface with nymphs and larvae. And then there's also a style of fishing that's called swinging soft tackles, similar to what you're doing with a streamer, but the soft tackles will look a little bit like a dry fly, except their material isn't quite as buoyant. These flies will be just under the surface of the water in the surface film. And the soft tackles are imitating a fly just before it hatches and becomes an adult and flies away. And so the fish, a lot of times, if you see little dimples, I'm sure all of you have seen fish come up and just dimple the water. Typically what's happening when trout do that, they aren't taking dry flies, but they're eating what we call emergers. It's what happens before they emerge into the adult or the dry fly, what it's imitating. And these soft tackles in the surface film, if you cast your soft tackle out in front of you, let the current belly your line, and then just dead drift that through the current. Once your fly reaches downstream, straight out in front of you, that's typically when you're going to get the hit, and the fish will take your fly. And that is very, very effective on a lot of our tailwaters in this area. So let's look at just a setup real quickly. And I apologize in advance for these very crude drawings, but I did it quickly because I just wanted to be able to show you. But if you're dry fly fishing, you basically have your fly line, you have your leader that goes down to your tippet, depending on the size dry fly you're using. Let's say if you're using a size 20, a little tiny size 20 dry fly, you would put on either a 5 or a 6X tippet, and then just tie on your dry fly. If you're going to do a lot of dry fly fishing, you want to have something that's called dry fly dressing. And it's basically, it almost looks like Vaseline, but it's a water repellent, just a little bit of silicone that you can rub into your dry fly, and it kind of waterproofs it. And so it sits up nice and high on the water, because after you fish a dry fly a while, it's going to start getting kind of waterlogged. And so you can just dry it off, put a little bit of this silicone on it, and it will keep it up nice and high in the water. There's also some powder that you can use, and you just put your fly in the powder, shake it up really good, and this little powder gets on it and also helps to keep it up high and dry. I really like the dry fly dressing, just the silicone, and that's basically what I use. So that's the dry fly setup. When you're fishing when you're fishing a nymph or a larva, now dry fly is visual. You can absolutely see the take when the fish come up. I mean, there's no mistaking it. They slam on that fly, and you know when you have a take. It's not so easy when you're fishing subsurface with a nymph or a larva. And so in those cases, we use something called a strike indicator. And I know you're all saying, yes, it looks like a bobber. I know it does, but we're way too sophisticated as fly fishermen to say bobber. So we call it a strike indicator. And they come in all different types. There's a pinch on indicators. You can see the one indicator on the far right. This just looks like a little white pill. There's some sticky substance on the back, and you just pinch that right onto your leader. Typically, you want your indicator to be about 1.5 feet greater than the depth. So let's say if you're fishing in water that's maybe 4 feet deep, you'll want to set your indicator about 6 feet up from the fly. So about 1.5 feet times the depth is where you want your strike indicator to be. And so you'll place the strike indicator on your leader, then you'll have your nymph or your larva positioned or tied on down below. Some of my favorite indicators, and they truly do look like bobbers, are the little airflow or the airlock indicators. The airlocks come in different sizes, and that's the little white, pink, and the orange indicators you see at the top. There's a little screw cap that comes off with a slit in it. You put your leader down inside the little slit, screw the cap back on, and then if you need to adjust the depth, you just unscrew it and then just move that indicator up and down. They're highly visible. They float very, very well and will hold up some pretty large and heavy flies, I have found. But there are also yarn indicators. There's little footballs that have a toothpick that you can stick in. I've tried all of them. And honestly, some of my favorites now are these airlock indicators. Just, they're so easy to use, and they really do float very well. So we call, typically there's a catch-all term called nymph fishing. And when you're nymphing, you're fishing subsurface, and typically you're fishing below an indicator, a strike indicator, and that's so that you can detect the strike. So you cast out, your indicator is floating downstream along with the current. If your strike indicator disappears, stops, if it moves, if it does anything different than just float downstream, then typically you've had a strike and you set the hook. So that is nymph fishing. There's also a term called fishing a dry dropper. And this would be when you tie on your dry fly, and then if you take about 12 inches, maybe 1.5 feet of tippet, and tie that directly onto the hook bend of your dry fly, like I've shown in this picture, and then tie a nymph or a larva to the bottom of that tippet. Now, when you cast out, your dry fly has 2 purposes. Sometimes you'll catch a fish on the dry fly, and sometimes you'll see the dry fly disappear. And in that case, it's serving as a strike indicator, and the fish has taken the nymph or the larva. So anyway, that's just another way to fish. I've fished this way many times when I was out west. We call it a hopper dropper because your dry fly is a big grasshopper that's very buoyant, and then you have a nymph tied on below, and it's so much fun to fish little pocket water where you're just casting that grasshopper over either around the rocks or next to the bank, and sometimes they'll crash on the hopper, and then sometimes the hopper disappears and you know they've taken that little copper john or whatever fly that you have on the bottom. There have been many times when I've caught fish on the top and the bottom fly at the same time. So it can happen when you're fishing 2 flies like that. And then finally, this is one of probably the best ways to fish on the Caney Fork and a lot of our tailwaters is fishing a tandem rig. And basically it's like fishing, like I showed you a minute ago, with the hopper and the dropper, or the dry dropper. You're fishing under a strike indicator, but you fish with a weighted nymph or a larva, and then you tie, which is going to be subsurface, and then you tie another piece of tippet material to the hook bend of that nymph or the larva and tie on another subsurface fly. So now you have 2 flies. We're fishing them in tandem, right, in line together. And the nice thing is you're fishing at different areas of the water column this way. Again, you may catch a fish that's hovering, just 3 or 4 feet above the bottom, or you may catch a fish that is right on the bottom and really hugging down close. And so it gives you a time to be able to fish within that water column in different areas by having those 2 flies. It actually gives you a little bit more weight too if you're fishing in current, because your flies are typically going to be weighted either with a bead or with lead built into the fly. But if you are in faster current and you need to get down quickly where the fish are typically holding, you could add a little bit of split shot, which I show on the right-hand side. Just pinch that on just above one of your flies, or even some twist lead. I like twist lead. I like them both. Probably I like the twist lead a little bit more because I find it's a little easier to get off of the leader once I've put it on. Okay, that was a lot of information, I know. So I will take a break for a second. Yes, good.
Hey, Melanie is asking if she uses, now I'm unfamiliar with this term, Loxa on dry flies. So I'm assuming that's a floatant. It makes a film on the water. Is that something she should worry about?
I have used some that has that film. I know what you're talking about. I've never really found that was a problem, but I will give you a hint. There's a product. Oh gosh, and it just went right out of my head. Hopefully, one of my friends out there can. I can picture the container. You get it at Walmart. It's an eye makeup remover, and it's called Abilene. Yes. So it's in a little white jar. It's about this tall. I think it runs like $10. Now, if you go to a fly shop and buy a little tiny jar of floatant, it's probably going to cost you $5 or $6. Or you can get this big jar that's almost like in an Noxzema container of Abilene, and it'll last you forever. And it's the same exact thing. But I've just kept some of my old little floatant containers, and I just fill that up whenever I run out. I probably will only buy one jar of Abilene ever, and that's all I'll ever need. And it doesn't I don't see any film on the water when I use that, but that's just a little cost-saving tip that y'all can try out.
And I got another question. You mentioned working with the current. Do you do something different if you're fishing on still water, like a small pond? How would you fish any of these rigs that you've shown us?
The only thing that you definitely can fish a dry fly, in a little pond. You could fish a dry dropper. In fact, typically if I'm fishing for brim, or a little bluegill, I'll have a little popper that floats up pretty high. And then I'll tie a piece of tippet and a little drop off, a little fly like a hare's ear or pheasant tail, and drop that off of that, the popper. And typically I will catch throughout the day 2 fish at a time, because they'll take that popper, and as I'm pulling it in, they'll take the bottom fly as well. That works for smallmouth. I've done the dry and the dropper, putting a big, like an ant pattern on the top, and then something that looks like a crawfish as my dropper on the bottom. I've caught many smallmouth that way. But also if you're in a pond, casting all the way across the pond and then taking a streamer and just stripping that through. I mean, you can pull in bass, you can pull in anything in that pond. Catfish. So the only one of those I would say that I haven't done that doesn't really work that well in a pond would be the wet fly. That swinging a wet fly. You really need that current to be able to swing that wet fly, in that emerger through the current. Everything else though, from fishing a dry fly, a dry dropper, fishing under an indicator, or fishing a streamer, definitely is going to work on a pond.
Good deal.
Okay. So you were asking a little while ago, Barry, just about, how much is it going to cost me to get into this? And we talked a little bit about the rod and the package and what you could get, for $150 to $200. A few things that you absolutely have to have. I mean, you can buy all kinds of neat little gadgets. I mean, it's a lot of fun to shop for fly fishing gear. But if you really want to stay within a budget and you aren't real sure if you're going to get into it, these are some of the must-haves. So you definitely have to have your rod, your reel, your fly line, a package of leaders that we talked about. I would suggest just getting a couple packages of 3X leaders, and then maybe a spool of 3X tippet and 5X tippet. That's really all you would need, the 3X leaders, 3X tippet, and 5X tippet spools. You'll definitely need some nippers. You could use fingernail clippers. Those will work for a while. After a while, they'll probably get rusty and they'll probably wear out. And you'll want to step up to some actual fly fishing type nippers, but definitely fingernail clippers will do the trick. Hemostats, I think, are very important. They're just little, they almost look like snub nose scissors. They aren't sharp on the end. They're just rounded and smooth on the end. This will help you to reach in, especially with little bluegill that have tiny, tiny little mouths. You just can't get your fingers inside their mouths to get out the little small flies. And having the hemostats, you can reach in, clamp onto the fly, and just pop it out very easily. Hemostats are also really great if for some reason you happen to get a hook stuck in your finger or your hand. You can take those hemostats and pop that right out of your skin. Then you definitely are going to need some flies, obviously, and I'll talk some about flies in a few minutes, some of my favorites. But you need to have a container to keep those flies in. For years, when I first started, I used just a little Altoids tin or little container. I put a little piece of just foam inside and just use that little tin and put my flies, which makes it really easy if you want to label your flies, because you've got that little foam insert that you can just cut out, and you can, this is what I did. I put number 14s, number 12s, and I just listed them. I had them all lined up and I could see what was what. You don't have to buy an expensive fly box. You can use any kind of container. There's been times I've even used a wine cork, and I've just, placed my flies on that wine cork. But you need something that you can carry, your hemostats and nippers and your flies. You need something, either a lanyard similar to the one that's shown in this picture. You can see that this has a little mount where you can put your tippet material on there, and then just put your fly box, in your pocket, or a vest or some kind of a fanny pack, just to be able to keep your things in. But I would say this is the minimum, and the must-haves, just to get yourself started. If you're in the summer time fishing, even if you're in a tailwater, especially around here, summertime, it feels very refreshing just to fish. We call it wet wading when you don't have on waders. I typically will wear a pair of Chacos or some kind of water shoes, some quick dry shorts, and a fishing type shirt, that dries easily. And I'll just wet wade like that. Now, in the fall and in the winter, you'll have to step up if you're going to fish and get a pair of waders. And you can get some, even at Orvis, a name brand like Orvis, you can still get some inexpensive waders and boots. And a lot of them have warranties on them. So, if you do get a leak, a lot of the manufacturers are very good about repairing them. Some, the higher end waders that you get, some of the manufacturers will even replace them. So you'd want to look into your waders. But for just starting out, and getting in the, in the summertime, you could even go without waders. Anybody have questions about any of the gear that I've talked about so far?
I do have a question. What do you use when it comes to a leader? Do you use a 7.5 foot or a 9 foot? Or what do you recommend and why?
Well, if I'm using a really a big streamer, let's say that I'm going to spend a big share of the day just casting some streamers to some smallmouth. I don't want to use a long 9 foot leader at that point. I want a nice, short, stout leader that's going to turn over that wind resistant fly. And so in that case, if I'm using a larger fly, even if it's a larger, like a great big ant or a big hopper pattern, in that case, I would probably use maybe a 5 foot to absolutely the max would be 7 foot for a bigger, heavier type fly like that. Remember, the energy is going to be dissipating as it goes down that tapered leader. And if you've got too long of a leader, you aren't going to have enough oomph to flip over that fly. So think, you know, big wind resistant flies, you want short, stouter leaders. If you're fishing up in the Smokies or anywhere where it's skinny water, it's very, very clear, the trout spook easily, then you're going to want a longer leader that's going to give you a little bit more invisibility from the fish, and it's not going to punch the fly out. It's going to softly turn the fly over and land it gently on the water. So most of the fishing that I do on creeks and in the tailwaters, I'm typically using a 9 foot leader and then adding tippet material to it. Because if you're fishing in an area that might be 5 or 6 feet deep, you're going to have your strike indicator, you know, set, and you may be fishing 15 feet down below your strike indicator. So I typically will buy 9 foot leaders, and then I will just add to them if I know I'm going to be fishing under a strike indicator. But if I know I'm going out smallmouth fishing and I'm just going to be fishing my streamers, then getting 7.5 foot leaders, that's going to work for you all day. I hope that helps.
Oh, that helped a bunch. I fall into that category of trying to cast for smallmouth with too long a leader, because that basically just ties you in knots at the end. So it helped me. And
or knock. You probably get knocked in the head a couple of times too.
Yeah. Let's see. That's all I've got right now. And
okay. Well, let's take a look at some of my favorite, all-around favorite flies, and I can tell you that these work everywhere. You know, if you take a look, now these are some of my favorites that I'll go through, but if you take a look online and just look up classic flies, you'll be able to see, or you could Google flies that work everywhere, or, you know, something like that, some kind of a Google search that way. And you're probably going to see things like woolly buggers and hare's ears. And I mean, just a whole listing of classic flies that are going to work no matter if you're on the Watauga or you're, you know, out in Ennis, Montana, you know, fishing out there somewhere. So these are just some of my favorites. I have used these not only in our tailwaters around here, around Tennessee, but I've used them in Kentucky and out west in Wyoming. I've used them everywhere. So for a dry fly, if I only had one dry fly that I could use up in the Smoky Mountains or basically anywhere, probably a dry fly Adams would be one of my favorites, because it will imitate from mayflies, it will imitate some little midges. So you can't go wrong with a dry fly Adams. And if you get them in larger sizes, like a size 12, then you could easily use it as a dry fly and then drop a nymph off the bottom, and it's still going to be large enough and buoyant enough to be able to hold up and not be drug under the water from a heavier nymph. So definitely a dry fly Adams would be one of my favorite all around dry flies. The guacamole stick bug is a type of a streamer, and it was actually created by one of the fly shop owners that used to live here, Chuck Robinson. And he, I think it looks like an anorexic kind of woolly bugger. It's tied really, really skinny. And you can either cast it in and just let it dead drift, or you can impart some motion to it. It looks like a little minnow, I think, swimming, and I've caught many, many fish on the guacamole stick bug. It's a terrific bug. And they can be tied up not only in just green, but I've tied them in fact, this was one of my big flies this year for smallmouth, is using this fly in more of a burnt orange color. I think it looked a whole lot like a crawfish pattern. So anyway, that's a big one. Some people turn up their noses at the squirmy worm, but it really does a good job. It just has such movement in that pink kind of silicone material. And, you know, even though some people frown on them, they seem to work, and they work well in the springtime on the caney for sure. Eat It Chucks, that is another one from Chuck Robinson, same guy that did the guacamole stick bug. This is just one of many patterns of a wet fly. Again, it doesn't have that real buoyant material, so this particular fly will just be fished in the subsurface, just in the surface film of the water. You swing it through, and as it straightens out, the fish will really grab it. And this is one that you would want to fish if you see a lot of dimples and coming up into the surface. Probably my all-around, one of my favorite flies is a beadhead pheasant tail. I fish these in all different sizes, as large as a size 12 and down to size 20s. 18s probably are the smallest I go on pheasant tails, but size 12s. Zebra midges are a really great fly in all different colors for our tailwaters. Okay. I only have a few more slides left. I know we're getting a little bit long, so I only have a few more. Did you have another question, Barry?
I do. $1 million question here. How many casts with no hits does it take for you to change color on a midge?
That is such a great question. You know, you're going to find as you start fishing, you're going to have confidence flies. I have 3 or 4, maybe a half dozen or so patterns I have so much confidence in. I don't go through my fly box and just keep changing color. There are some, I know if the fish are there, I'm going to catch them on this fly, because I really don't believe that, in all honesty, it's really about the fly or the color, and sometimes even the size. I think it's about the drift. The drift is how natural you can make that fly look as it's moving through the water. And so I guess the answer to the question is, I mean, if I know a fly should work, I may only change 2 or 3 times throughout the day. And I'm not going to go through color after color after color. So I just may change location if there's nothing right there, or change my depth. That's another thing. If you aren't catching fish and you know that they're there, you may need to add a little bit of lead, little split shot, and adjust your indicator so that you're getting right down to the bottom. Most times when I see people aren't catching fish, it's because they aren't getting down quick enough and they aren't getting down deep enough.
Along that line of getting down deep enough, if you're casting, how far upstream do you cast from where you're expecting to catch fish for your fly to get down? Does that make sense?
Well, it really depends on the current, the speed of the current. Typically what I will do is I'll set my indicator to where I'll actually see that I'm tagging or bumping the bottom, and then I'll bring it in and I'll just move it like an inch. And so I know I'm really getting down deep. So I purposely will snag the bottom just to see, okay, if I'm not familiar with the area, I'll purposely do that so I know that I'm getting down. And it too, you know, depends on how far up I'm going to cast. I guess how much weight that I have on the line. You know, because it's going to get down relatively quickly, and you don't have to cast that far upstream at that point.
Okay. Good deal.
All right, quickly, we're just going to go through the knots. I highly recommend looking up a website called animatedknots.com. You can get it as an app on your phone, or you can just set, you know, where you can go directly to the site. You can actually download a bunch of the knots and have them on your phone if you purchase the app. I think it's only like $3 or something. But it's nice because it shows an animation of actually tying up the knot. I have trouble just looking at diagrams, but if I can actually see it happening, it makes it really easy. You have to know the loop-to-loop connection, and that's looping your fly line to your leader. So you absolutely have to know that, so you'll know how to attach the loop from the leader to your fly line. So make sure that you get on and you understand how to do the loop-to-loop. You need to know the surgeon's knot. This is where you tie your tippet material to your leader, or the different tippet pieces to each other. So you definitely need to know the surgeon's knot, and you need to know the improved clinch knot. And the improved clinch knot, of course, is what you use to tie your fly on, but improved clinch knot you also use when you need that loop to be able to hook over the hook bend if you're fishing a dropper. So you tie a clinch knot in the bottom of your tippet with no fly attached to it. You just tie, you know, an empty clinch knot. And then you slide that over the hook bend, and then you cinch it down just like you would cinch it down to the eye of the hook. I hope that makes sense, what I just talked about. But anyway, those are the 3 knots that you absolutely have to know, no question. Okay, very quickly, it's going to be hard to go through, you know, to give you any good ideas or instruction on casting. I recommend that you go to a casting class. I know Orvis has some free classes throughout the year. Cumberland Transit here in Middle Tennessee does. You can come see me. I charge $40 an hour for a casting class, or you can go through a full day of a school and learn all kinds of stuff. And I'll tell you about that here in just a minute. But you really need to perfect the roll cast. The roll cast is a cast that it's basically just a forward cast. There's no back cast involved. This way you won't get caught up in any trees or rocks or brush behind you if you're in a tight location. So the roll cast, the loop of line just forms over your shoulder, and then you just do the forward cast out in the front. One of the most important casts you need to know. And then the basic cast is the Real Pretty River Runs Through It cast. It's where you peel the line off of the water. The loop of line will roll out behind you, and then you come forward, not in a throwing kind of motion, but almost in a, like you have you're chopping a piece of wood. It's more of a hatchet kind of a motion as you're coming forward. Those are 2 casts. I mean, you could get on YouTube and take a look. If you want a video, I can't recommend enough Joan Wolf's DVDs, or you could just Google Joan Wolf Rollcast or Joan Wolf Basic Cast, and she will just lay out in some free YouTube videos the different casting techniques. But I highly recommend getting an instructor, at least if you're first starting out. It's a little bit of an investment, but you won't learn any bad habits. You'll get those knocked out right from the beginning. Okay, very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, just a few of the Tennessee tailwaters, of course, around here in Middle Tennessee. The Caney Fork is a great one, the Elk River, Duck River, the Obie, down below Dale Hollow. Of course, you've got really great, and these are stocked trout streams. We don't really have any natural reproduction that goes on here. But if you move on into East Tennessee on the Watauga and the South Holston, I mean, we just have some amazing tailwaters around that area. Also on the Clinch River, right there near Knoxville. So a lot of good tailwaters that can be fished. If you are going to fish a tailwater, I urge you to download the TVA Lake Info application to have on your phone. It will show you when the generators are going to be released. The last thing you want to do is to go to a tailwater and be clueless about the generation schedule, because that's how you can drown. Yeah, the water can rise very, very quickly. And I have talked to people that didn't even know they were on a tailwater. And so it is so important that you understand that. And if you have trouble reading the schedule, I encourage you to drop me an email or a text, and I'll help you with that. I feel like it's that important for your safety to know about that. So anyway, great place for trout fishing, but just make sure you're aware. Some of you may not be aware that TWRA has a winter stocking program, and there could be a stream or a body of water in your backyard that you had no idea held trout, because in certain areas like on the Harpeth or even down below Percy Priest Dam in the Stones River, TWRA will stock trout throughout the wintertime, December, January, February, March, all through those months. And they typically don't hold trout throughout the year because it's just too warm of water. But this is an opportunity to get out during the winter and fish for trout in bodies of water that you typically wouldn't see. And if you just look up TWRA winter stocking, you'll come to this link. It's going to give you all the different counties and cities throughout the state, and it gives you the date that they will stock. And most of the time when they stock, they'll hold over through the winter for a couple of months. So it's not like you have to be there on the day that it's stocked or you're out of luck. I mean, you've got several weeks, and in some cases, a couple of months to be able to go to those bodies of water and fish. Around the Middle Tennessee area, I'm definitely a guide and an instructor, and would love to have you come out, and I can show you a thing or two. Trout Zone Anglers, David Knapp is an excellent guide and does a lot of his guiding in the Smoky Mountains, also on the Clinch River. He fishes that quite a bit, and also on the Caney. And I can't recommend David highly enough. He's excellent. David Perry has Southeastern Fly, is another excellent guide, does a lot of guide trips on the Elk River. I know both of these guys do some muskie trips. And so, look them up. If you're up in the Smoky Mountains, of course, the Rudders, Ian and Charity Rudder are fantastic. You've got a really great fly shop there in Townsend with Little River Outfitters. It's always open to give you some information. And then one of the best guides around in East Tennessee is Patrick Fulkrod. And if you're going to East Tennessee to fish the Watauga or South Holston, you need to look up Patrick with South Holston River Guides. He's absolutely amazing. It's hard to find anybody any better, and he has quite a few guides that he fishes with there. If you've got questions about that though and you didn't catch it, just shoot me an email. I'll be happy to help you. Shops around here in the Middle Tennessee area, Fly South, of course, is fabulous. Cumberland Transit. It's hard to beat Ronnie Howard, Grumpy, over there at Cumberland Transit. We have an Orvis shop in Green Hills. Bass Pro Shop has some good information that they give out there. And then Outdoor Experiences in the Cookeville area. Sawyer is a terrific guy that works there at Outdoor Experience. The fly shop's on the upstairs part. If you've never been in there, it's terrific. And then out in Franklin, Binks, their outfitter there on Columbia is a really great shop. That's some of the Middle Tennessee area fly shops. And if you're headed over to East Tennessee and aren't sure exactly where to go, just shoot me a note and I'll be happy to help you. If you want to come visit me, and I'm going to wrap up now with this, if you want to come visit me, I am located just upstream a little ways from Happy Hollow. This is my camp or my school. I do a lot of casting classes, one a month. And my schedule is on my website right now for 2021. I have a casting pond, and then the Caney Fork is there, just right there behind the cabin that's pictured. Most of the class is done around the casting pond, and we go back and forth from the casting pond back into the cabin. If you come out and you just can't stand the thoughts of leaving, I also offer overnight stays for people that have either classes or guided trips with me. It's $75 to stay overnight in either the Airstream or one of the little vintage campers, but that includes dinner and it includes breakfast. So it's a really great deal. So that's $75 a person. And I mean, it's a really nice way to, you know, to do a full day class and then stay overnight. It just makes for a really nice, nice outing. So since it is Christmas, here's a few ideas for gifts. I think I mentioned lessons are $40 an hour. My full day classes run from 9 until 3. The group classes only take 6 people in a class. It's $145, 9 to 3, lunch is included, and a copy of my new book, which covers in great detail all the stuff that I talked to you about tonight and then more. My wade trips are $275 for a half day, $325 for a full, and then float trips are either $325, but you might as well do a full day because it's $400. And I do most of my float trips on the Caney Fork. Occasionally I'll go over to the Elk, but mostly it's on the Caney Fork. And I do a little bit of wade trips on some little creeks and streams around. So, and finally, my new book is Thrasher's Fly Fishing Guide. It's, as I said, it goes from the very basics, but then it also has some really good information in there for intermediate, even to advanced anglers on some technical information on fly line design. I cover European nymph fishing and just some specialty type techniques. So anyway, that's all I have. I know we ran just a few minutes over, but I'm open for any other questions, Barry.
Yes, anybody have any questions they'd like to ask Susan before we get off here? Everybody's saying thank you. I had one question. Basically, if you're learning to fly fish and you're breaking a sweat while you're casting, you're doing it wrong. Is that what you told me in the beginning of this?
Absolutely correct. Yes. Yeah, you're the more gentle that you can cast, the better.
Okay. Everybody's saying great class, awesome. Thank you. We do appreciate everybody coming in and listening to this. We hope that you got what you wanted out of it. Susan, I appreciate you because I knew you'd be able to deliver this and in a way that everybody could understand. And I learned a lot. So
good.
I thank you for doing that.
You bet.
Saying thank you. And so somebody says, please do more. So maybe we'll have to get back, do something else. But
okay.
Yeah, I thank you so much for doing it. And we appreciate it.
You said you recorded a session. Will you be getting that out to, or is it just going to be on the site, or how will you get to that?
I think that it's just going to be recorded and put straight to YouTube, and we'll send out a link to the folks that were in this class and they can look at it, but it'll be there for everybody. So you can send it to whoever you want to. And okay. Is that right, Jason? It'll be available to everybody.
Sure. And if you're okay with it, Susan, we'll share it on our Facebook and that kind of thing too.
Okay. Sounds good.
Awesome.
So maybe next time we need to just get everybody together for a fishing class.
Well, again, if you go to the site, the whole 2021 schedule is listed there. And then, and I do private full day classes as well. So.
And I will say this to anybody that's on here, if you've never fished with a guide, it might be something you would really enjoy. And I say that because even if you know what you're doing, a guide will take you to the next level because you'll learn so much on that day of fishing because they do this day in, day out. They can read the river. They can tell you where you're going to catch fish. They can tell you what you're doing wrong with your cast or other techniques. So if you've never fished with a guide, think about it. Susan would be a great one, and she listed a lot of other great ones, but it will make you a better fisherman.
Mm-hmm. For sure. It's an investment, but it's well worth it. Promise.
Yeah. All right. I think we're done for tonight. Thank y'all. We appreciate it.
Thanks again.
And Susan, you've been awesome.
Good night. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.